wanna see your face. I wanna know your heart. I wanna walk with you every day of my life, God.
Hi, welcome to Devos with Debbie. Again, today we're going to be looking at Numbers 31 to 33 and a little bit in Luke 7 and 1 Corinthians 7. So sorry for the traffic and the noise. So this, as I was reading today, actually emerged a theme that sort of ties them all together. All these passages together, words. Okay, so really, I'm just going to look at Numbers 32, actually. And it's so interesting. So, for some context, the Israelites are about to cross into the Promised Land, and this is after an entire generation had been wiped out, had died. I guess not wiped out. An entire generation died, and a new generation raised up. Because that generation didn't have faith to enter into the Promised Land. They doubted that they could take it with God. Something God kept saying, I have given you this land. So these two tribes, Reuben and Gad, are now coming up towards the Promised Land, and they're just at the border. There's the River Jordan, and there's the west, and there's the east. So they're on the east side, I believe. Could be switched. But it's so interesting. They ask, can we stay here? They're about to cross over into the Promised Land, a land that they've been told is flowing with milk and honey. Sorry for ambulance sounds. Yeah, they're about to take over this Promised Land, about to cross over something that God has told them is flowing with milk and honey, is going to be a place of abundance, a place of victory for them. And they ask, can we stay here? Can we settle on this side of the River Jordan? And it's so fascinating, the response. First off, God gets angry. It says the Lord's anger was kindled. And he recaps a little, I took your fathers out of Egypt, and only 2 people trusted me. That's Caleb and Joshua. He said, for they have wholly followed the Lord. Those 2 people, Caleb and Joshua. But the rest, that entire generation, God didn't allow to see the Promised Land because of their lack of faith. Because, so anyways, he says, don't discourage the heart of the people of Israel from going into the land that the Lord had given them. It's just so sad. They settled for the deal that they kind of eventually worked out was, okay, so you don't want your people to fight in this war. You're going to leave the Israelites going into battle down 2 tribes. And so they worked out a deal where they would fight, they'd leave their women and their children in little fortified, and their sheep in little fortified places. The men would go off and fight with Israelites, and then after they win the Promised Land, the men come back and they settle on this side of the River Jordan. So that's the deal they reach. But still, you just see how they're not trusting God. They are settling for second best, Even after they've agreed, they're going to go in and fight, they're settling for second best. And that really hit me. God's plans are so good for us. And yet us, out of like a desire for security or safety, just playing it safe, um, you know, feeling like we're not entirely sure God's plans are going to be the best option, we settle for second best. And the passage in Luke touched on this a little too, which was really interesting. I guess I'm saying really interesting a lot today. um, yes, so in this passage, there's disciples coming up to, um, disciples of John the Baptist coming up to Jesus, you know, trying to figure out, like, should we follow Jesus? Should we follow John? And it's so interesting. Jesus is, you know, basically telling them, hey, I'm here. You know, John already made it so clear in his life, you know, like, I am here to make a way for God, like to prepare the way to go before Jesus. And if we settle with just being apostles of John, you know, versus Jesus, we're gypping ourselves. You know, we're missing out on why John came. John kept pointing to Jesus, you know, let me like decrease, him increase, like less of me, more of Christ. Um, so in that sense, they're settling, but also there's this strange little verse mixed in there, you know, as Jesus is emphasizing, like, okay, I am like John was amazing, John was great, but I am greater. And he says, when all the people heard this, the tax collectors too, they declared God just, having been baptized with the baptism of John. So, like, the tax collectors, everybody's like, wow, okay, this man is like Christ, the Christ. But in verse 30 of Luke 7, it says, but the Pharisees and the lawyers rejected the purpose of God for themselves, not having been baptized by him. And that part is so sad. Like, they have the way, the truth, and the life right in front of them. They even had John come before Jesus, you know, to prepare the way, and yet they reject the purposes of God for them. And they settled for half of the gospel. You know, like the light is here. They settled. So sad. Like, they have the Old Testament. They have this rich history that leads up and illuminates like who Christ is. It's so valuable. It's such an important part of the Christian faith to look at this Jewish heritage, this Jewish narrative. But they just settled for half the story, you know, for various reasons. Maybe skepticism, maybe blindness, maybe just fear of giving what it would mean to give up everything and follow Jesus. But it's still just so heartbreaking that they had Jesus in front of them, and chose to stay comfortable. And I'm thinking about that and how many times I choose what I think is best for me, knowing very well that God has other plans, you know, and I settle for my plans, for my life, and they're just second best. They're never going to meet up to the promised land that God has designed or the gospel story that God has written, but I settle for the Old Testament only, you know. The Old Testament only is a beautiful narrative, but so incomplete. And the east side of the River Jordan is okay, but it's not the promised land. It doesn't have all that God has prepared for them. Yeah. Um, that's a good word just to dwell on. Oh, and a small side note. Wow, this is gonna be long. Sorry. There's just this beautiful image too of Jesus is asked over to a Pharisee's house, and they're eating, and this woman overhears that Jesus is there, and she brings this very expensive, like, oil ointment perfume thing called alabaster, and um, she comes in, and she's like a woman of the street, like the scriptures just say, a sinner. um, I'm assuming, like, or a woman of the city. I'm assuming, she's a prostitute or something. And she comes in and is just weeping on his feet and pouring the oil on his feet and wiping it with her hair and kissing his feet. And the Pharisee who's like hosting Jesus says, like, if the, if this guy was really a prophet, like, he would know that that woman is a sinner. And Jesus, responds to him in the most incredible way. This, I didn't. It just floored me. I forgot this whole part of the story. He says, a certain money lender has two debtors. One owed 500 denarii, and the other 50. When they could not pay, he canceled the debt of both. Now, which one of him then will love him more? Oh, it's so beautiful. And then he says later, therefore I tell you, her sins, which are many, are forgiven, for she loved much. But he who is forgiven little loves little. And it just like puts everything into perspective, especially with born again, like with people who have encountered Christ later in life, and they do have this whole history of sin. We can never ever think that we're better than someone else, like better than someone else in the family of God. Like, with the family of God, we all come in and our debts are all canceled. And there's like equality there. There's like we're all on the same playing field for that expression. That's helpful. Um, but you see, like, God pointing out her her sins were so great, but they were all forgiven. And living in that reality has got to influence how you pursue Christ, how you love Christ. So it's just a reminder, and also a reminder of God's love. God's love is equal, um, but He did forgive 500 denarii and 50 denarii debt. You know, and that great love lavished upon us is just such. We're so undeserving of it. You know, mini sidebar, and then last thing, I promise I'm almost done. But I just feel like I need to comment on this. um, so 1 Corinthians 7 is all about, singleness and marriage, and it's really interesting. Um, but and challenging to read some of this stuff. But I thought Paul made a really good point here, and he's talking about, um, you know, if you are unmarried or widowed, like, what are the advantages of staying single? Um, and one of the things he says is that with, like, when you're married, you get wrapped up in these worldly troubles, because you are thinking about your husband and your wife, like trying to make sure they're okay, like your kids too. He doesn't mention kids, but that comes with marriage most of the time. And so, yeah, you're wrapped up in these worldly troubles, but if you're single, like, your interests aren't divided, and you can be free from those anxieties that are tied into marriage. And this verse in particularly stood out to me. He says in verse 35 of 1 Corinthians 7, he says, to secure your undivided devotion to the Lord. And it's true that in singleness it is easier to have this undivided devotion to the Lord. Not saying that it only comes in singleness. I think there are parts of marriage that illuminate like who God is. You learn more about who God is. You have a partner beside you pushing you in the faith, and that's so important. And I really value that. It's something I want. But as a single woman, I see like that I can pursue God with this undivided devotion. Um, and when He says go somewhere, I can go. I can get up and go. Okay, this is too long, so I'll end there. Lots of thoughts, but let's not settle. Let's not settle in our singleness, in our like understanding of the gospel. Let's like take the full gospel and where God's leading us. You know, trust Him to lead you to the promised land. Like where He leads you will be the place where you will thrive the most. So okay, that's it. Bye.